before spring break. We won't be joining you next week, but we will certainly the week after that. And we're delighted this evening to have, for the first time, Dawn Mckeen, who is an award-winning journalist who spent nearly a decade researching and writing her grandfather's story. The 100-Year Walk, an Armenian Odyssey, was a finalist for the Dayton Literary Peace Prize and received an Outstanding Book Award from the American Society of Journalists and Authors. Previously, she covered health and social issues for Salon, Smart Money, and Newsday, where her investigative series on assisted living facilities, Poor Care, helped prompt legislative reform. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, Elle, the Sunday Times Magazine of London, the Los Angeles Times, and elsewhere. She lives in Southern California, and we're very glad that she's with us here today. Welcome, Dawn.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. And it's such an honor to be here. You have an incredible program. You have an incredible lecture series. And I just feel so honored that my grandfather's story, as told in the 100-Year Walk, can be a part of it. And we can talk about what happened to my family during World War I and the last days of the Ottoman Empire, when my grandfather, along with the majority of the Armenians, were deported, and the government drove more than half of them to their deaths. I'm very grateful to be here today. So,
Dawn, did you have a PowerPoint?
Yes, I was just.
Okay, so I'm just going to make you a co-host, and then you can share your screen.
Excellent, thank you. Okay.
There we go.
Okay. 1 minute. There we. Hold on. 1 second. Okay. So, okay. So ever since I could remember, my mother has been telling me the story of what happened to her father, Stepan, and the dramatic stories of how he had survived this horrible desert march in what's now eastern Syria, and how he had staggered across the desert for a week with only 2 cups of water and no food, and how he'd been so thirsty that he was so thirsty that during this week-long crossing of the desert that he had to drink his own urine. He had to drink his own urine. And as a child listening to this, and these were stories my mother would tell me all the time, like around our breakfast table or on our dinner table. It was just so normal for her to speak about this horrific period in her father's life. I would, as a child listening to this, I couldn't understand why someone would be so thirsty that they would have to drink their own urine. And, I would go to school and I would talk to my friends, and, none of their grandparents had done that. And it's just something that stayed with me for all, since I was a child, because to try to understand and explain the genocide to a child, it's still something that it's still difficult as an adult for me to understand how this happens, and just the horror that someone goes through. And my mother would, when I would ask her questions, she would point to these 2 booklets, and they're in Armenian, and they were published in the 60s. And she would say to me that her father's story was all in there. And these were booklets that my grandfather wrote, detailing his account of survival. But for most of my life, I never understood what was in there. My grandfather died when I was a child, and I could never ask him more questions when I was older. And also I couldn't read Armenian. So, so I couldn't read these books for myself. And I didn't know much more than that, since I didn't learn about the Armenian genocide in school like I had with the Holocaust. And so it remained a mystery for most of my life. And the story that my mother would tell me about her father was one that she knew from by heart. Every day after school in New York, where they had moved once they had left Turkey, her father, in this background of, he had a candy store. So there was like bubble gum and soda pop and candy. And next to all this sweetness, her father would take her back to the Ottoman Empire when the government deported the majority of the Armenians from their homes and drove more than half of them to their deaths, including countless Greeks and Assyrians as well. And Adolf Hitler himself referenced the Armenian genocide right before his invasion of Poland in 1939. He said, "Kill without pity or mercy. Who still talks nowadays of the extermination of the Armenians?" And in a way, Hitler was right. For only the Armenians seem to remember the Armenians. Though my grandfather had fled Turkey and was making a new home for himself in New York, he still hadn't comprehended that he had survived. So each year he would issue a warning to my mother. He would say, "Anahid, I'm going to die next year." And so my mother would tell me she would spend the whole year in her childhood worried her father was going to die. And then the next year would roll around, and then, he would still be alive, and, he was physically healthy. And then he'd say, "Anahid, I'm going to die next year." And so this went on. And so my mother grew up just always thinking she was going to lose her father, because for so long, he just never quite believed that he had escaped his death sentence, and passed on this worry to my mother. And in the house he eventually settled in Los Angeles, where they moved during World War II, he had put all these locks on the door, almost like barricading himself inside, always worried, even at the age of 88, which is when he finally passed away, that someone was going to come and kill him. Now, my grandfather worked through his trauma by writing. And while many others could never speak about what they endured or witnessed, my grandfather could not stop talking about it. And he spent his life documenting his witness in his journals. And in doing so, his children say it was almost as if he was purging it from the depth of his soul. As he wrote in his journals, "Being a witness to that satanic pogrom, I vowed it as my duty to put to paper what I saw." And when I could finally read my grandfather's journals, I could not believe what it said. A relative had translated it, and I'll never forget, I was working as a reporter in New York, and I had kind of this, I printed it out as this old stapled copy and brought it on the plane. And I just sat there weeping on the airplane, but also in disbelief that this was my grandfather. And I just couldn't believe what he endured. And with each narrow escape, how close my whole family had come to not existing at all. And so not that many survived the massacres near Deir Zor, which is now in eastern Syria. My grandfather's account, for many Armenians, the name Deir Zor echoes much like the word Auschwitz does to many families of Holocaust victims and survivors. And while my grandfather is long gone, his account is important testimony to a crime that Turkey still denies occurred. So undertaking this book, as soon as I read my grandfather's story and the pleas from my mother for so many years to help her tell her father's story, it became not an option for me. I realized I was spending my whole life telling other people's stories and not my grandfather's. This was my inheritance. While some people inherit fine china or beautiful jewelry, I inherited this story along the responsibility of retelling it. So I decided to totally uproot my life. I quit my magazine job in New York, and I came back to California, to Los Angeles, and to tell my grandfather's story. And it was this, it was a very strange situation because I landed back home, and I landed back in my old room, like my old high school room. I know some of you, maybe it's only been a couple years since you left. For me, it had been a long time. I was in my mid-30s, and I'd gone from living on my own with my friends, and then all of a sudden I was back at home, and my mom was asking me, what time are you going to come home again? And I just felt, it just felt so strange. And then I was trying to tell my grandfather's story, and my mother said she had all these friends of her parents who were still alive, who could talk about the town and what happened when everyone was deported. And so she started calling all her friends at nursing homes, all these, old people who were survivors. And each time, she would find out, the person had just died. And as a reporter, I was used to, I'm used to interviewing people who are alive and hearing their account. And it just became too hard, I felt, to tell my grandfather's story. We had these 2 booklets, but there were a lot of holes. And how could I tell the story? So I wanted to quit. I just told my mother, I cannot tell your father's story. And she did not want me to quit. It was her dream, my grandfather's dream, for his story to be told in English so more people could tell. So with this huge fight, and I said to her, I just blurted out, I cannot tell your story unless you raise your father from the dead and have him tell me what else happened to him. And so the next day, I woke up early, and my father kind of rushed to my door, and he said, Don, come to the dining room. And I went into the dining room, and there was my mother. She was sitting with just this, like the whole place looked like an earthquake had hit the room. And she was sitting there with all these books pulled out of the bookshelf. And she was sitting there surrounded by books, and she was holding these old notebooks. And she looked up at me, and there was, I could tell there was Armenian writing. And she said, it's my father's writings. He wrote more. And so we started to go through that. And, a lot of those books were all about his life before the war, which is very important, in a genocide, to speak about what the life, besides, the individual lives, what was the life and culture that they lost. And my grandfather just, filled these notebooks with so many stories, just funny stories and hijinks and of him even, with his friends, just, sneaking wine out of his friend's house and getting into a cart and, going on these joy rides in these horse-driven, carts and just the life that existed at that time. And so I realized there were more. So we called my mom's brother. And I just said, please look through everything in your house. I know there's more of my grandfather's story. And he called, and he had discovered, after looking through the garage, there were more notebooks. So, and as we went through that, it was just this incredible experience of, my grandfather had written his whole story. So I want to read, and these are copies of some of the oldest pages of the journals and that my grandfather wrote. And as you can see, the state of some of it. I want to read a selection from my book now. And the book alternates between, it's mostly about my grandfather's story and his experience and his survival. And then it alternates with me trying to find out what happened to him and my quest to tell his story. So I'm going to read a chapter from, it's actually the first chapter. It's called The Lost World. And this is right after we found these journals, trying to find out what was in them. In the coming days, my mother and I scrambled to the homes of her friends and relatives in the close-knit Armenian community, the newly discovered notebooks in hand. This quickly became my social life in Los Angeles. Everyone I hung out with was upwards of 70 years old, fluent in Armenian and willing to translate upon request. Doilies and plastic tablecloths were often present, and all my new best friends had an insatiable curiosity about my love life. Still single at 35, why had I not found a man? They knew just the right person. We also relied on my mother's cousin Yevgenia to help the translation as we wanted to spread out the time-consuming burden. She lived high up in the Santa Monica Mountains, and we often gathered in her sunlit breakfast nook, the brightest room of the house, to pore over the notebooks. At first, Yevgenia struggled with the script. She hadn't read Armenian since she was a teen in Beirut, but then it came flooding back faster and faster. She translated my grandfather's words into English. I still don't know what I had expected with these journals. After all these years stashed away, one notebook remained remarkably intact. The other did not. It was yellowed and stiff, the edges curled up as if someone had held a flame to it. Yevgenia, who could read as well as speak Armenian, generously spent days with us reading from the same cursive Armenian ink, precise and uniform. We often stayed there until large shadows fell around us and lights began to turn on one by one in the homes on the hillside. In the weeks and months that followed, this was all we did. Yevgenia had known my grandfather and felt as pained as we did at his revelations. Often I could tell a terrible passage was coming just by reading her grimaced face as she read my grandfather's words. Like pickled sardines, we were lying on top of each other without any sleep. The next morning, they took us out and tightened our bonds. These last two notebooks, the ones from my uncle's garage, covered the missing time from 1914 to 1915. Though the writer was clearly the same, his tone had turned somber since the war's outbreak. While his early words had related all the mischievous antics with his friends, now he told of a darker time alone. I could see the man he was becoming, the seeds of sadness planted. For all my mother's devotion to her father's story, these were details that she had never heard. Listening to the recounting of her father's awful days, my mother would stare out somewhere far off, her narrow eyebrows frozen in extended arch, as we heard about how his feet were beaten with wooden boards. Did he cry out, I wondered? For his mother? For God? In other passages, we learned how he was pushed to the river's edge to be shot by 2 gendarmes. We also listened to him describe the richest girls of his town and how they had carried the embroidered fabrics of their dowries from camp to camp until they realized there'd be no future, no wedding, and had traded them for bread. I bit my lip and inhaled deeply to keep from crying. Often when Yevgenia turned the page of the fragile notebook, the corner would snap off and fall softly to the sunburst-colored placemat underneath. Periodically, we would stop to tape the corners back onto the pages. At times, full sheets came away from their decades-old binding. Yevgenia patiently proceeded despite holes in the paper that had swallowed entire words. She was as entranced as we were, having no option but to try to follow a road that was quickly being washed away. I had no idea, my mother would say, shaking her head. I had no idea. We were both getting to know this side of my grandfather, 2 generations trying to piece his life together. It was as if my grandfather had understood what he couldn't finish in his lifetime would be finished in the next. Sometimes we had a pile of the damaged notebook pieces and were unsure where to place them. We'd search for the matching triangular shape on the page or the interrupted sentence. It's like a puzzle, one of us would say, each snippet, whether it was there or missing, revealing the shape of my grandfather's life. and transporting me back to the past where I increasingly found myself living. I wanted to leave the present, often cutting short evenings with my friends to go home and study the era. In addition to his account, I was consuming every memoir and history book I could find about the Armenian experience during World War I and all those years from 1914 to 1918. With my grandfather's words as my guide, my day-to-day life receded into his. In my dreams, in my waking hours, it was a lost world that I began to inhabit. So it felt like a force greater than me was leading the way back to my grandfather's hometown of Adapazarı, now called Adapazarı, about 100 miles east of present-day Istanbul. And before the war, my grandfather, he worked as a courier, basically, and would transport goods between his town and Constantinople. And here's actually one of the streets he writes about in his early journals. And you can see all the different languages on, it just showed how cosmopolitan and all the different cultures that were in Constantinople at the time. And my grandfather would walk up this hill with heavy bags on his back and to deliver them to different locations in the town. And by reading my grandfather's unearthed journals, and my grandfather is on the left, as you can see, I learned about how mischievous he was. He was the kind of person when, my grandfather was someone who had to stop. He had to drop out of school in the 3rd grade because his father had died. And in those days, the boys had to, go to work and help support the family. And my grandfather, so he didn't continue with his education. So one day he was, in this large crowd. It was for this anniversary celebration in Constantinople, and there were all these well-heeled people walking around him. They were all marching up this hill. And my grandfather and his friend just started making up a language and talking to each other just for fun. And he watched kind of all these erudite people stop, and they're trying to figure out what language they're speaking. And then he said, and they asked him, and they couldn't figure it out. And my grandfather, oh, we're speaking this language. And, he did all these things that he just made him. He was funny. Another day he went to all his friends, and they were all part of a committee to kind of build, right before the war, they were building a community center in their town and for performances and everything. And, he kind of called all his friends, and he said, oh, we have to meet at this place in the middle of the workday. And he got there, and they're all saying, Stepan, what's this important meeting? Why do we have to be here? What is it? And then he would have someone come in and deliver ice cream to everyone. So this was what he was like before the war. And as I went through his journals, it hit me. This is what a genocide does. It erases. I had reduced my grandfather to this one label, to that of being a genocide survivor, just this sad man, who lived out the rest of his life, just, being haunted. And so I continued to try to tell a story, and to tell the story of his town, I went through all the newspapers of his town that were in Armenian, and went through all the old headlines. And there were headlines like, a bull was stuck in the river today. We tried to get him out by pulling with another, a horse-drawn cart. But then there were all these other issues, like they were discussing education curriculum and women's rights at the time. And it was just, I really just felt, I was just immersing myself in this world so I could document better what was lost when the war began, when the genocide began. And I believe that this project, and these are all photos I'm going to show you in the next few frames, are photos of people from the town. And many of these were from my grandfather's sister's garage. She had long passed away, but we found all these old photographs of the different classes in the town before the genocide. And as I started to research this project, I thought it would take me 2 years. But with, survivor testimonies scattered around the globes, wherever you think about, wherever the Armenians, those who survived, wherever they went after the genocide, there were, it was just scattered around the globe in multiple languages. You're talking about French, Turkish, Ottoman Turkish, Arabic, German, English. It took me 10 years to go through it. And I just thought that if I could find all the missing pieces, I just thought that if I could find some of the missing pieces, I could help better tell my grandfather's story and that of other Armenians and what they endured during the genocide. And I also searched for the people. My grandfather wrote down names where they were from, the people who were in his caravans, the people from his towns. And a lot of times in the camps, the Armenians of certain towns would stay together in certain areas and help each other. So I took out ads in these Armenian newspapers, and I found some families. And one of the families I found, the daughter of one of the survivors was still alive, and she was in her 80s living in Washington State. And I flew up there, and the daughter of this woman, Manig Dobajian, and Manig's father sold, my grandfather wrote about selling water to her family in one of the camps. He was, he had found an old carton and would carry water from the faraway kind of creek and bring it to the camp to make a little bit of money to eat any bread. That they were all so hungry. And Manig, and when I met with Manig's daughter, her mother Manig had written her own account, and so I was able to go through that, and there it was. And she writes about being in Katma, and then about them being on the same caravan route as my grandfather. And so all of these things helped me kind of weave a story of my grandfather and others with supporting information. So if my grandfather, if there were gaps, accounts like Manig's, like what the camp looked like at that time, helped to paint a larger portrait of what happened at that time. And in the end, and this is also just another picture of one of the classes in Adabazar and I use this as my screensaver during the whole project while I was researching my grandfather's story, because I could not stop looking at their faces of these girls. They were a graduating class, high school class, and not knowing what was about to happen. And I spent countless hours kind of staring into their faces, and whenever I felt like quitting doing the story, I just knew that I had to continue. And in the end, I drew on collections from 6 countries, including this monastery in Vienna, where I visited in the middle of winter to look at their remarkable collection of old Armenian periodicals. And I was able to look through old newspapers in Constantinople, and using my really bad French to kind of move through and see which really important stories. And all of each document brought me closer to a grandfather that I hadn't really known before. But in the process, I was realizing how accurate he was with his accounts. And so as I dug deeper into my grandfather's story, I realized that I had to retrace his steps and see the land where he had marched, and so many had lost their lives. So in 2007, I started out from his town of Adapazarı and went across Turkey. And this picture is this map is during the Ottoman Empire, but I crossed. I took the train where he took the train, and then I was able to hire a fixer when I crossed into Syria, and crossed Syria all the way to eastern Syria near the Iraq border. And luckily I did this before the Syrian war, because it would have been too difficult to travel after that. when I landed in my grandfather's hometown, Adabazari, I was clutching this old map that I had photographed from this old 1939 book, Armenian book. And my mother and her friend had done these like cartoon, like bubbles around everything, you know, the Armenian cemetery, the Turkish cemetery, but I was talking about the Armenian quarter, where the marketplace was and all these things. And so I went there and I arrive in this town and with this very naive map, but, still hopeful, still naively hoping that there were at least some parts of the Armenian quarter that would still be there or something. And but the town was so different, earthquakes had leveled it and there was just really not much that I could find of the old Armenian population there. When it was about half the population, the Armenians in that town. I found the old Turkish cemetery, but I could not find the Armenian one where my great grandfather was buried. So when World War I erupted, my grandfather and many Armenian men were conscripted into labor battalions, like this one pictured here, and doing road construction. And in the next year, in 1915, my grandfather heard that the Armenians, that his family was being deported from his town, and many Armenians were being pushed out of their town onto the road. And he tried to escape to go to his widowed mother and his sisters and his nieces and nephews. And, a group of them tried to escape, but they were caught. And so, and this is often what happened, the men were separated from the women and children. And his family was, these are his sisters and his nieces, and they were put into cattle cars like this and pushed into the middle of Anatolia, while my grandfather was pushed toward farther east. So I want to break again and read a selection of my grandfather's story. He had heard that his family was in a camp around a train station and had sent advance word that he was going to be on a train coming through there. So in hopes that they would be able to see each other. Around midnight on that dreary night, a cattle car pulled out of the darkness and into Chai Station. On the platform, Stepan's brother Arminog tried to catch his breath. With his sisters trailing him, he had sprinted there from his tent, pitched in the nearby field where the Mckeen family had been living. He did this whenever he heard the siren's call, always hoping it carried his soldier brother Stepan. Peering inside the compartments, Arminog could tell it held a labor company, a good sign. But he couldn't find his little brother. Had he received false information? Stepan should have been calling him by now, shining a light, something. Yet the cars remained still like a ghost train. In one car, Arminog approached a work serviceman. No, Stepan was not there. Precious time elapsed. He asked another, who directed him to a different car. Still no luck. Arminog had one last car to check. He found someone from back home who knew Stepan. Nudged awake, Stepan learned his brother was outside, loyal Arminog, whom he hadn't seen in more than half a year. Already Stepan had dozed away precious time, and now he had less than 2 minutes remaining before the train left. With the guard sleeping nearby, he grabbed onto the high iron window and pulled himself up. Glancing out, he could see his brother, his face inches from his. How he'd longed for this reunion, and it was almost gone. Arminog pushed a small pouch through the bars. It had money, Stepan could see. He couldn't accept it, and he shoved it back into his older brother's hands. The locomotive hissed. It was about to depart. One final time, Arminog forced the pouch back, besting him like a game of hot potato. You need it more than I do, Arminag insisted. The brothers began to weep. Goodbye, Stepan said. Kiss everyone for me. The eastbound train rocked away, widening the distance between the two. Stepan grew smaller by the second, like a lost kite, until he disappeared completely into the expanse of night. Stepan laid awake, reflecting on the sadness of it all. Was that our last conversation? He wondered. The moment weighed as heavy as his fatigue, to which he eventually succumbed. The next morning, Stepan awoke to feet trampling him as the others scrambled toward the train's exit, queuing up at the latrine. The train had pulled into the town of Konya, the Vilayet's capital, and home to 50,000 residents and a camp where many families from Anta Bazars now lived. Suddenly alert, Stepan had the urge to urinate. He stepped behind the others into a line that snaked around the station. The wait gave him plenty of time to set aside the 40 para fee and count the remaining money in Arminag's pouch. 200 hurush. That was about 2 weeks' wages for unskilled workers, even more now that there was hardly any income. 200 hurush that his family needed also. Half an hour later, Stepan climbed back into the cattle car, which continued eastward on the Baghdad Railway. In the near future, a passenger would be able to ride from Berlin to the far-flung Arab city. At the moment, though, the tracks dead-ended at the foot of the Taurus Mountains, the direction Stepan was headed, its craggy peaks already visible. Across a plain, Stepan's train trembled down the last of the tracks, towards Bozanti station, the end of the line. Outside, the sunlight illuminated what they would soon cross, the Taurus Mountains, rising approximately 2 miles into the sky. Clouds usually dipped around the peak of the most western part of the Himalayan mountain belt. At Bozanti, the troops and supplies were unloaded and then packed onto mules or carts for transport to the other side. The tracks picked up again there, almost as if the railway had been holding its breath through the mountains. Then everything was reloaded onto the trains. All of this occurred during ambushes that came on like tropical storms, and lives hinged on the speedy reinforcement of servicemen. Ahead of Stepan and his workmates, the crossing loomed, as it did for all Armenians pushed this way. All that carved rock, steep cliffs, bottomless gorges. 18 hours of walking. Not many Armenians survived the passage. Beside towering pinnacles, Stepan's train halted. At the station of Bozanti, the guards were changing. From there, the conscripts would march. 2 cavalry guards positioned at the fore led the way. Clutching 3 days of rations and a hefty pack, Stepan strode into line, and all the men were steered onto an old caravan path hugging the mountain. It was just the beginning of the grim journey to the plain, and eventually the ancient town of Tarsus, or so they hoped. Already some men couldn't walk. They had rented donkeys to take them across. The cost was 20 hurush, 15 for the gendarmes, 5 for the owner. On the trail, Stepan stepped in the wake of the caravans and work battalions that came before. An hour passed on the road, then another. Ancient fortresses barbed the terrain. 5 hours into their march up the mountain, as Stepan's company passed a thick grove of trees, footsteps pounded from behind. Stepan turned to see a Turkish captain charging toward them, brandishing a thick wood baton. In a rush of confusion, Stepan froze. When the captain caught up, he started swinging his stick left, right, and center. Stepan crumbled under the blow, his whole body sharp with pain. His friends did too, their screams rising into the higher altitudes. "You are not advancing fast enough," the man howled. With a thud, the club crashed down on Stepan again. On the road again, as I too headed east, following my grandfather's path toward the looming Taurus Mountains, pictured here. The chiseled rocks and cliffs remind me so much of Yosemite. And I couldn't stop thinking about my grandfather and so many others that didn't make it across these mountains during that time. And here's another picture of some of the terrain. So as my grandfather, marched over the mountains, he found himself in what's now Syria, and he was passing through an encampment of so many tents and Armenians, and he was able to escape from his battalion, and he kind of melted into the deportees. And he always, in his journals, he kind of distinguished, I was no longer, a soldier. Now I was a deportee, and kind of wandered around these tents and trying to find people from his town. And this, the town that he escaped into in January of 1916, there was an estimate that more than 1,000 people died in the camp due to the elements and also disease. And after that, the way they would close the camps, oftentimes they would come burn the tents with the people inside and push the people along farther east across what's now Syria. And my grandfather was he found himself, they were taken to what's now eastern Syria, near the border of Iraq, what's now the border of Iraq. And he the guards were always telling them they were going to go home. And at this point, he realized that he wasn't going home anymore. And this was most likely the last moment of his life. So I'm going to read an excerpt from this part of the book. And this is about this was about my grandfather before his caravan was massacred. Whatever happens will happen, Stepan thought. I'm not afraid of death. At the bottom of his sadness, Stepan had an epiphany. It was so clear he praised God right then and gave thanks. For a long time, Stepan hadn't been able to see the positive side to anything, yet he had a revelation. He would be the sole person killed in his family, only him. Somehow, according to his latest information, his mother and 4 sisters and brother had remained in a camp in Anatolia and avoided the death march to the desert. That meant they had a chance, and he'd most likely be the only victim. At least that's what he'd hoped. I'm lucky, he consoled himself. This moment also had significant personal meaning. It was the anniversary of the death of his father, Hovhannes, September 25th, 1916, in the old Julian calendar, October 8th in the Gregorian one. He had died 20 years earlier when Stepan was only 10. All the time, Stepan had missed him, but not for much longer. On this Sunday afternoon, the grown man closed his eyes, pressed his long, thin hands together, and prayed, "Dear Father, today I will be with you." The time had come to line up. Through his fog of thoughts, he could hear the guards scream, "Everybody ahead!" The Armenians rose to their feet, obediently standing in front, behind, and beside one another. The last caravan had formed. Why should I leave my 20 hurush to these butchers? Stepan asked himself. Taking out his precious change, Stepan spotted an Arab merchant, one of the many who had traveled to this area with sacks of dried grapes and dates to be sold at inflated prices. Stepan approached him and bought some raisins at about 4 times what they would usually cost. Stepan savored them. Skeletal and nearly naked, he dropped the shriveled sweetness of each one into his mouth. He could feel the raisin plump with his saliva, almost come to life, and taste the pop of a sugar rush as he bit down. Then he positioned himself among his friends, all his money gone. Soon they would see the sign. 10 minutes passed like this. The quiet was stifling. It was still enough to hear his own breath, his own beautiful breath. Finally, the guards motioned. Another raisin plopped into Stepan's mouth, and his legs, thin as skewers, began to move. Where? He didn't know the exact coordinates, but this time he knew his final destination. So just before the massacre of my grandfather's, the night before the massacre of his caravan, he got down onto his hands and knees and snuck past the guards and then faced a walk across the desert for a week with no food and 2 cups of water. And as others around him died or were killed. So from my grandfather's journals, I knew that there was another person who survived this massacre, and his name was Hartun Atanassian, and he's on the front row of the screen on the left with the mustache, kind of receding hairline. And Hartun was from my grandfather's town, and my grandfather ran into him at the end of the war, and so he knew he survived. And so for years, I tried to find out, did Hartun ever write about this? He was a teacher in his hometown. He wrote for the newspaper in their hometown before the war. And just something inside me told me that he had documented what had happened. And there was nothing else that told me that except just just an instinct. And it was this instinct. It led to a search for years to try to find out if Hartun Atanassian ever wrote about what happened to him, what he experienced. And after years of research, I finally found his account. In 1920s, he had written about it, and also another account published in 1940. And I found them in Armenia and archives there, and also in Bucharest, where he had moved after the genocide. And when I found these pages of his account, and he dated that massacre that my grandfather escaped from, both of them had escaped, he dated it within a day of my grandfather, and wrote about, saying goodbye to his wife for the last time, because there was a rumor that the women would be saved. But it's moments like this that I'm just dumbfounded that this atrocity is still denied, that while the eyewitnesses are gone, many of them left a paper trail. And so at the massacre site, where my grandfather and Hartun Atanassian escaped, an Armenian church was later built there in remembrance of all those who had perished. And so after, this was the area that my grandfather escaped. After fleeing Markadan, my grandfather had heard about this incredible Arab sheikh who was taking in Armenians. And my grandfather, that he was just very sympathetic, that he was very sympathetic. My grandfather still, he was so scared. He changed his appearance. He put on local dress, and he had picked up some Arabic, and he approached this sheikh. And but the sheikh was not fooled. He knew that my grandfather was an Armenian. He knew where he had escaped from. And despite the government, despite their difference of ethnicity, of religion, of language, and the government's rhetoric that Armenians were these dangerous people, he took in my grandfather and treated him like a son. And as I neared Syria as I entered Syria on my own journey, I wanted to find the family of that sheikh who saved my grandfather's life. It was just, it was one of these things that I just had this very strong feeling that I had to try, and nothing told me that I could, but I just wanted to see if I could find anything that could provide information about these incredible people. So my fixer, he took us, he was helping me. He was a local Armenian man from Syria, and he took me to to Raqqa, which later became famous when the Islamic State made that their headquarters. But in this time it was peaceful, and he took me to this Bedouin sheikh's house, who's pictured here. And he was the most incredible man, and he took me into his house, and I told him what I was doing, and he told me how his own clan had saved 20 Armenians, and how he knew these stories, and they were passed down through the generations, about what so many of family members had witnessed along the caravan trail. and he just vowed to help me. He invited us into, I was traveling with two people, he invited us into his private quarters. He gave us sweet dates and tea, and he called someone else in the town, and they started calling around the region to see if 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 the sheikh's family was still there, if they could find information, and they found one. They said there were two Abu Hamids, and they called one. They asked if asked if they had a brother named Ali, and they said no. So then he called the next one, and then he was on the phone, and I just thought, okay, this is not going to happen. And then when we hung up, he said, we found them, and they are expecting you. So it was just this most incredible moment of my life. And that night, this Bedouin sheikh insisted that we stay at his house, and we went out to this incredible meal on the Euphrates, and all of us sitting there, different backgrounds, and came together. And then the next day we headed out to the small village, and this is, on our way, we were driving, and we turned into this small village. And when I was approaching, all of a sudden I saw 300 people, scattered about. And it was on an earlier day than this, but you see this mosque in the background. And I thought that service had just given out, had just ended. And all these people started walking toward me with outstretched arms and smiles. And these women soon whisked me away, and they gave me this hijab and their beautiful dress. And they brought me into this room where all these people were waiting. And we started to talk about my grandfather and what had happened when he had come. And as I would tell a story, they would break. I was just reading from my grandfather's journals directly to them about his time there. They would break and say, we've heard this story. We've heard this story. The stories, bits and pieces of it, moving through the generations and being told. And then after that, they had this great big, great big feast for us. And they had slaughtered a goat. And then we sat around this platter, and all of us together, and I was able to thank them for saving my grandfather's life. And it was just the most incredible experience to thank these people, because this one kind act, 4 generations and soon to be 5 of my family are alive because of it. And then after that, we went out to the cemetery where the sheikh was buried, and I was able to pay my respects to the sheikh out there. And that's me pictured with one of the grandsons of the sheikh. And so during this, during the Syrian war, when after the Islamic State had taken over, they terrorized the civilians in these towns and in these areas where my grandfather barely survived, and so many had perished. And even at the nearby Armenian Genocide Memorial, it was blown up. And during this time, you see so many things that just had echoes of what had happened a century earlier, of all these people being marched in the desert. And we saw the persecution of minorities and other Muslims who were considered not faithful enough. And a United Nations Human Rights Panel called the killings of the Yazidi minority in the region for what it was, a genocide. So in these divisive times, with yet another refugee crisis unfolding, I often return to the story of my grandfather, a Christian Armenian, and the sheikh, a Muslim Arab. And their relationship was a testament to crossing the boundaries of religion and ethnicities and connecting. And my grandfather did not survive this alone. He knew that he only survived because he was saved by other Christian Armenians, Muslim Turks, and Muslim Arabs, and never forgot those individuals. And since the decade that I spent researching the story, it changed me, because I'm so inspired by what my grandfather and so many of those people who lived through this, what they endured and what they went through as refugees. They had lost everything and yet still stood on their feet again. And, many married and had families like my grandfather. They pressed on in refugee camps and, learning new languages and new skills, just with starting from nothing and rebuilding their lives and passing on their resilience to their children and strength to the next generation and beyond. The United States helped, and here's a picture of the orphans actually thanking the United States for their help. And after the genocide, my grandfather was so desperate to leave, and so his family fractured. Some of them went to France, and one part stayed in Turkey. And my grandfather and his sisters, they came, his sisters and children, they came to the United States. Same with his mother came to the United States. And then my grandfather and my mother and her sister eventually came here aboard this boat, arriving in 1930. And my grandfather eventually moved to Los Angeles, and where he's pictured here, and never stopped. He finally was able to have a house again after, and never stopped thinking about what he witnessed. And on the 100th anniversary of the Armenian genocide in April of 2015, my mother, Anahid, and I walked through Los Angeles with about 150,000 other people. And she was so moved as we walked. She couldn't believe that so many people had come here to talk about, to remember what happened and to speak about it. And it's a powerful reminder that our voice matters. On the 106th anniversary of the Armenian genocide last year, after many years of pressure and speaking out, President Biden called the killings for what it was, a genocide. And it's a reminder that our stories matter, that our pain matters, that what happened a century ago still matters, and the way it has rippled through the generation, that it's never too late to acknowledge a wrong. My family will never forget what happened in 1915. Nearly every Armenian story has a story like my grandfather's. And we also don't forget how so many crimes of genocide have been committed since then and are still being committed. So, so many families have a story like my grandfather's. This book and my grandfather's story is in their memory. Thank you.
What a moving story, and what a journey that must be for you. And I'm sure it's still going on. Did you stay in touch with the Sheikh's family in Syria?
Yes, I did. It was difficult during the war, and it, reception was spotty, and then it was really difficult, obviously, when the Islamic State took over Raqqa and their town, and
the worst place.
Experienced
probably
so much death in their village. And so yes, but we're still in touch, but it's difficult. They're still undergoing, so it's still difficult for them.
And did your mom ever go back to Armenia?
She never went to Armenia. I actually visited Armenia, where my family was from, what's now Turkey. But I visited Armenia to speak at the American University there a few years ago, and we really wanted her to come. She wanted to come so badly, but the travel was so difficult. But when we did find the family that saved her father's life, we called her, and we kind of woke them up in the middle of the morning. And my mom just couldn't. She was just screaming, and oh my gosh, we put it on speaker with them, and we were all crying, and it was just an incredible experience. And again, it just has stayed with me, just how one act of just being their family of just standing up to hate and rhetoric and propaganda, how it could save a whole family. So it's an incredible experience.
Did you ever read a book called My Father's Paradise?
No, I haven't.
Okay, I'll talk to you about it later. Cynthia has a question for you.
Okay, absolutely. Hi.
That was so incredibly moving. And it wasn't just that your grandfather's story is inspirational, and it's not just that there were all these people there who helped him along the way. I really appreciated what you said about how he didn't do it alone, or you can't do something like that alone. It's incredibly moving because I'm going to get choked up here because of what you're doing for him. I think, and you said early on that you felt like you had inherited the responsibility to tell his story. And you also had the quote up there, that being a witness to that satanic pogrom, it was my duty. I don't know if I got it, if I'm getting it verbatim, but it was my duty to put it to paper.
Yeah.
There's a real theme here about responsibility, or the obligations of survivors and descendants to be a witness and share these stories. And I was just wondering if you would mind just talking about that a little bit more, like the dawning of that realization and what that was like for you, what that felt like.
Yes. Thank you for your kind words. Yes, it was something that it was something I was actually kind of walking away from most of my life, because my mother kept telling me the story. As I said, she would speak about it all the time. And every time, I eventually, was moving on, in my career and had moved, from California to New York, and I would fly home and visit my family for the holidays. And she was there trying to translate her father's story into English. Every time I was there, she'd be carrying around this big Armenian dictionary, and slowly she would have all these loose pages in it, and with her writing and I'm translating his story. But what I realized later is that her Armenian was not good enough to she came here as a little girl. It was her first language, but it just, so she was struggling, but it was her life's work to do this. And she kept telling me, Dawn, will you help me? Will you help me? And, I would just, oh, Mom, I'm going to go now back to New York and my life. And I always knew it would require this big change in my life. But it wasn't until, I was able to read the pages when a relative had translated into English. And I was finally, I had read so many books about the Holocaust and other, crimes of humanity. And I was, I was speaking with Diane before we came on this lecture, just about how I've always been want to tell stories about people who are vulnerable. I usually write about health and people with Alzheimer's, or and it hit me as I was reading this that I was spending my life telling other people's stories, but not telling my own family story. And that's when it wasn't a choice for me. I had to tell this story. And I'm just, just being here with all of you here today. It was my grandfather's story for others to learn what happened. He had people dying in the desert telling him, if you survive this, tell the world what happened here. So that's also another thing that has stayed with me. And so the fact that you are all here and, many students, learning about this, if you didn't know about before, maybe learning a little more today through his story, through his witness, that has just made everything just matter. It's been my life's work to tell his story. And it means so much to me that people are learning about it through his family. So thank you so much for helping others learn about it through your forum.
You're doing a remarkable job, and I think you'll enjoy this comment from one of our audience members. She says, thank you so much. This was so moving. Your story following the route your grandfather was forced to travel in the Armenian genocide inspired my son, Lucian Novosel, to walk the length of Death Valley. 160 miles, acknowledging that it in no way replicated the pain of your grandfather's journey, nor that of his grandfather, my father. My son said it was what he could do. He attempted it 3 times. Due to severe foot blisters, he abandoned his first 2 attempts. He succeeded on the 3rd attempt, this time accompanied by a friend. He documented it in a video that he posted on YouTube. His video seems relatively lighthearted when you consider what motivated it. Nevertheless, he did it, and it's more than I have done. I was inspired, as I am inspired by what you have done.
Okay, now you just made me emotional. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I would love to see the video. My website is dawnmckeen.com, and you can email me through the website. I would love to learn
She
more.
posted the video link here, so hopefully we'll get it to you. I'm sure she will as well.
Thank you so much
Wonderful
for
post.
that. And it's really my grandfather who, it's his inspiration. So thank you so much for sharing that for me. What an incredible tribute to your own family's experience.
One of our students asks, if you could ask your grandma one question to answer something you never found the answer to, what would it be?
Wow. I had so many questions when I was writing the book. I guess it would be, at the end of my book, I kind of close with my mother's question to her own father. She wanted to know, because of the experience of the Armenian community losing so much, during this genocide, and having that added layer of having the Turkish government not acknowledge the Ottoman government's role, that it was a genocide, having your genocide denied, with this legacy of, kind of dealing with the pain of loss, but also having a country say, no, it didn't happen, or, blaming the victims. My mother wanted to know, she said to her father, she called him Baba. She said, Baba, should we forgive the Turks? And she said that he always, he sat there for the longest time, and he just was very pensive, and he couldn't answer. And but for my mother, she took that, for someone who saw everything that he went through and lost so many people and witnessed everything, the fact that, he didn't say no. He didn't say, no, we shouldn't. He paused, and for her, it was, the opening of reconciliation. It was kind of a bridge of healing for her. And it is for me as well. Because if you read my book, I really tried to, while there's so much darkness in this genocide, there was light with my grandfather, with the people who came across, despite everything, and who saved him, Turks who saved him. And so those are those stories that I looked, that give me hope, and hope for greater understanding, between the two groups, people in the future.
Well, this is a related question from one of our students. Says, during this lecture series, one of the questions we hear most frequently is why many turn a blind eye to horrific mass atrocities like the Armenian genocide. Others turn away from evil and do the right thing. Did you get a chance to ask the Sheikh why he saved your grandfather?
So, yes, thank you. That was what you said. It's very well put. The Sheikh died many years before I came. Only one of his children was alive. He was like I went to Syria twice. I went back to do more interviews with the family in 2009. But I asked the grandchildren were alive, and some of them very old and remembered him. But they said that it was they said it was part of their religion to help people and to take in people in need. And they said that when they first heard I was looking for them, when the Bedouin Sheikh called them when I was in Raqqa and told them I was looking, they said they thought that I was in need and they were ready to take me in. And so, which I just thought was like so incredible, because a lot of people, if you just showed up, like you wouldn't take in a stranger into your house. But although right now, I mean, the timing of our talk it's really timely, unfortunately, because of just this continued refugee crisis. You watch people take people in, and it's beautiful. Amazing when people can do that.
Have you been affected by any symptoms of generational trauma, especially after learning so many details about your grandfather's story? And if so, did that make any of your research even more difficult?
So that's a good question. I think I definitely think my mother was affected by that. She left Turkey. I mean, she was born after the genocide, but they left there because of the genocide, because they had lost everything and came here. And growing up with a father who was just traumatized. She said now we would call it PTSD. But then it was just this father who was just so affected by this, just living back there, that he almost didn't come to her wedding day because he was so upset. So I think my mother, absolutely. For me, it was so difficult to read these stories because I read countless and countless accounts. And that's why I just said, so many Armenian families have a story like my grandfather's. My grandfather, happened to write it down. And, many of them couldn't even speak of what happened because it was too difficult. It was so difficult to read these accounts. And I cried for so much of these years of researching it. But whenever I would start to, feel bad for myself, like, oh, this is so hard, I would stop, because this was nothing. Reading the accounts was nothing compared to what my grandfather and those people experienced. So I would just tell myself, turn the page, keep reading. If my grandfather could live through this and write this and go over his account year after year after year, I can tell his story, and I can read about the other people who went through similar experience and try to tell the world what happened here, as that man called out to my grandfather.
Yes, this is a similar question. Does feeling the responsibility to keep telling your grandfather's story ever give you too much stress, or make you feel like the task is simply too much at times? Or over the years, have you learned that this responsibility is a privilege and a gift?
Very good. I would say both. It is a privilege and a gift, because I know how I know that I am just very lucky that he left his story, that he was able to give testimony to what happened. And I feel very lucky that I was able to help him get it to a wider audience and give his voice to what happened. And, when enough of us give voice to what happened, we get louder. And, like I said, last year, finally, the US, after many years of pressure from people speaking about it, we acknowledge, and, Biden acknowledged it.
Doesn't reconciliation require acknowledgement?
It's a tough question.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's an individual question for everyone. I can't speak for other Armenian families. Every family has gone through something different. I can only speak for my own family, and coming to and how, my mother and I have found a way to heal. For me, healing was telling the story. And that was our voice that we made louder and is a part of the testimony now. So I think every family needs to ask that they know what they need for that.
In the same vein, do you believe that your grandfather helped his own personal healing by being so open about his experience?
I do think. I think it was cathartic for him because he felt that he had a larger purpose. He knew it. In the 60s, his story was, in the 1960s, after many years of not speaking about it, many Armenians started to, tell their stories, and, they came out, like his town, his fellow people from his town, they came out with a book documenting what they witnessed on the day that the genocide, when the deportation began. And my grandfather also, his story was serialized in an Armenian newspaper every week. They would read another chapter of what happened to him, because so few people returned from the area where he survived from. So yeah, it was just, I just feel like it's a privilege to have that he left his story. And I think it was, every day was important for him to tell his story, so it would be documented.
I'm sure he's very proud to have it documented so eloquently. Another question, are
you.
you sharing your grandfather's story with young people in schools? It's so powerful and so timely. We are all in awe of Holocaust and genocide descendants who are sharing their stories so that we do not forget.
Thank you so much. Yes, I am. And there's been high schools here in Glendale. They have the book and they've taught the book, for Glendale High School, and high schools in Orange County, and also different universities. I've lectured from Dartmouth to UC Berkeley to Washington State University to University of Wisconsin. I still would love my grandfather's story to be taught in more schools, and to, for his story to grow. So if anyone has any ideas on, I'm always happy to speak with students and help tell, through the lens of my grandfather, tell about what happened during those horrible years.
I'm sure the Alliance will be able to help you with that. Dawn, this was a very special evening for us. It's a remarkable story. It's an incredibly emotional story, and you've done a wonderful job and a great service to Armenians everywhere. Thank you so much for coming, and we hope to see you again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good evening.
Good night.
Good night.